Alright, so now that we've started with Altered States, this is our next year in this little William Hurt series, which is 1981, where he had two come out. Not too long afterwards, because we're going to actually start with Eyewitness, if we're going in release order, which is Eyewitness was in on February 13th, and then months later, Body Heat came out in August 28th, towards the end of summer, appropriately enough. So, to talk about Eyewitness, which is probably the least well-known movie we're going to talk about in this whole 80's series, probably, which is, it comes from the Breaking Away team, the director, Peter Yates, and then, Steve Tesser's the writer. And what's really interesting when you look at this movie, this being something that probably not as many people have heard of compared to the other movies we're going to talk about, it's got a hell of a cast. Everything from, Hurt to James Woods to Sigourney Weaver to Christopher Plummer to Morgan Freeman to Pamela Reed. Pretty much around every corner is somebody that you recognize. Kenneth McMillan, who was the Baron in David Lynch's Dune. Just all over the place. And what's really interesting about the way these characters come together is the fact that while this movie feels like it should be a thriller that works really well, it actually seems more concerned about the characters and their relationships than really anything else. Like, it almost seems like the murder that takes place that has to be solved in this movie is almost kind of put on the back burner, and I guess it depends on how you feel they handle the characters and whether or not, thrillers are kind of maybe more your thing, depending on how you're going to feel about this movie. Because I do remember, I have seen it at least twice, and I remember that it was definitely one where it kind of helped to know what the movie was going into it the second time. Because the first time I went into it, I kind of felt, I don't know if confused is the right word, but it was, well, yeah, I guess you could say a little confused, because there are moments throughout this movie where, when it is kind of trying to be the mystery aspect of it, it does, like, there's a lot of cases where this movie will introduce characters, like, cryptically, and after a while, after they do that so many times, it's like, it seems like the movie was kind of having trouble differentiating between wanting to be intriguing, but just kind of having these sort of confusing elements to it. And there definitely is a difference. Even if the intentions are intrigue, sometimes it might be off-puttingly vague to the point of confusing. But regardless of that, because we have a hell of a cast, there is definitely something here as far as focusing on the characters, whether it be just sort of banter in general or dialogue. Like, there's the moment when Morgan Freeman introduces himself and tells us William Hurt his name, and he says it should be easy to remember because his name is Black. And then just like maybe 30 seconds later, he runs into James Woods, and then James Woods says the exact same thing. He introduces himself, and Woods says, "Oh, that's easy to remember." And so stuff like that can be funny. There's a point in time where there's this sort of fake out scene between Hurt and Woods where it appears Woods might have possibly been trying to kill him, and William Hurt has this perfect delivery of, "You could have fucking killed me," pause for effect, "you could have broken my glasses too." I think how that's sort of the most important factor. Stuff like that can be very funny. There's the moment when we're introduced to Sigourney Weaver, and she's giving a scathing review of a Robin Hood themed musical, and then later on, Christopher Plummer says something like, "First you murder a Broadway musical, now you're investigating a murder." And it's like, so the movie's clearly having fun with dialogue like that, and it's kind of like got this old-fashioned sort of sense to it when you look at it as like this, mystery of sorts. But on top of this mystery, it also feels like it's intended to be like a paranoid thriller of sorts. And I kind of feel like if they had put maybe a little more effort into that and more focus on that, it probably would have been something that I'm a bit more enthusiastic about than I am. There is still something to this movie that's certainly interesting. But, yeah, like I was saying, it does seem like it breaks away from this a lot. Of course, being the breaking away writer-director team, but to where it focuses on the characters. So the main focus here is going to be this love story that's brewing between Hurt and Weaver, and there's something, because it's clear there's a lot of different things going on here, and I feel like that's probably one of the main problems that the movie has, even if you know what's going on, going into it, if you're seeing it multiple times. And it's like, it's got so much going on for what it is. And it's like, it's really nice when a movie wants to put this much focus on its characters, but it's like, how much is too much when you've got everything else going on that's going on here? And how it kind of feels like there's not really too much of a focus, to where it feels like we're kind of bouncing around things, so that when we do get these things that we should really, really care about, it just kind of feels like like it's not meshing with everything around it. So, like, there's definitely an awkwardness to this love story between Hurt and Weaver, but the whole point of doing this whole series is to talk about how amazing Hurt was, especially in this era, and to be able to take this material and somehow bring a believability to it. So there is the big scene when he basically confesses his love to her. He's basically saying, like, I've had a crush on you since forever, but knowing the character, he's essentially confessing his love to her. But this is like their first time meeting face to face, and he's doing it like while he's being recorded for an interview, where he's not exactly live, I don't think, but still it's a very awkward time and an awkward place to say the things that he's saying to this particular person. And the fact that she's trying to interview him about this murder that's taken place, and he's just kind of casually talking about himself like it's a dating profile, where he says things like, "I can do most things except dance," and just the very sincere way he says, "I can do most things except dance. I just cannot dance." And he talks about something that happened at the prom that he never really goes into, and it's weird. And there's like a later on there's like a buffing floors euphemism because he's a janitor. And just everything feels awkward, yet somehow he's really able to bring this sincerity to it, that he still feels like a real character with real emotions talking to this person. As just weird and out of place as it seems, there's something that rings true about it because of what he's bringing to it, and how he says his lines and everything else. Because there's the point in time later when she's on a horse and he's on his motorcycle, and there's like a flirtation going on here. It feels really weird and really out of place. Yet as soon as they just sit down and have a dialogue, it starts to feel real. There's another great delivery he has where she says, "You just come out and say the corniest things," and his response is, "What's worse is that I mean them." It's like somehow he manages to make this stuff work that just feels like it shouldn't be working. And that's really the key to the movie. But there's also him and the interactions that he has, where a lot of his scenes are not just with Weaver, but they're also with James Woods. And these are the scenes that really stand out in the movie to me, because if you want to talk about two guys that never feel like they're acting, anytime they have a scene together, whether it's big or whether it's small or whether they're joking around or whether one of them thinks the other is a killer, everything feels real between these two talking. It never feels like two guys acting. And honestly, I feel like that's kind of the case through both of their careers. They both just really specialize in that, and the way they especially really effectively make James Woods such a red herring throughout it. Kind of without leaning too hard into it, but it's like there's always that possibility, like, no matter how much it seems like, oh no, he's fine, there's always a thing that comes back to where the movie has you constantly guessing, is the killer James Woods or is it not? And whether it be, not just situations, but also, like, the way things are worded also. But then they also have ways that are really interesting where in the same scene, they can make you almost 100% convinced he's the killer, but then make you feel really sympathetic towards him. There's the moment when he's talking about there's the great scene that's preceded this, which was where he's broken up with Pamela Reed essentially, but it's like this moment where they both have so much bliss in the fact that they don't love each other, and it's like just the way you see them, like it looks like two people falling in love over the fact that they're not in love. And that's a really good scene also. And then the follow-up to that, because she is Woods' sister. And while we've had this great moment for our main character, we have James Woods saying, you know, it would have been great for me to have a family. And he goes through this whole thing about, you know, showing up for holidays and stuff like that. And it's like so shortly after we believed for sure he was a killer, now we like really actually start to feel sorry for him. Like I said, especially after it was such a triumphant moment for the main protagonist. And so I find stuff like that really well done also. And then just some of the stuff they put in here, like the behind the scenes stuff with the news when we see Weaver at work. And it's like when we see like how they're gonna put a sporting event together and how they're gonna report on that. And then going back and forth between that and this footage of her that she has. And that's the kind of stuff that seems to really stick out. And like I said, the whole murder mystery aspect is almost an afterthought, which is interesting enough that I feel like if they leaned a little more into it and maybe taken out some of the character... not all of them, but some of the character complications, this could have been a really interesting sort of paranoid thriller throwback kind of thing. But yeah, as it is, it's kind of just this weird concoction of individual things that work, but kind of seem weird in the context of everything around it. Because with all this other stuff going on, we've got at least a couple of action scenes where there's the moment that's right out of a classic thriller where Weaver's being followed, potentially to her death, and then Hurt has to come in and he like uses a chain to fight them off and save her. Like I said, a good scene and a suspenseful scene, but by the time we get to it, feels really weird and out of place as well. So it's like whether we're in the thriller or we're out of the thriller, it bounces around so much, everything sort of feels out of place. But like I said, the individual moments do find ways to make themselves work. But there's also a lot of... there's so many things that feel like detours, one of which is the scene where... and we kind of... it's weird because it still feels out of place and weird, but it's been built up to. Which is this moment when Christopher Plummer has poisoned the dog, and in the dog's like dying moments, it becomes essentially rabid, you know, just without rabies, and starts to attack Hurt in this really big way. And this scene goes on for a really long time, as the dog eventually sort of winds down and dies. And the thing is like, this... It's a lot going on for the fact that it's literally leading into this big fight scene with Christopher Plummer in the living room. And so, to follow that up, it feels even more unnecessary than it already kind of feels. Where it's like, I guess it's good for, you know, a suspenseful scene and everything, but like I said, since we're getting ready to have an action scene, and everything else feels out of place, it's like, he honestly could have just come home and the dog could have just been dead. And that would have saved us like 5 minutes of whatever was going on in this dog attack scene. So, like I said, it's like, I appreciate the things they're doing here, where they're adding things for the sake of suspense, adding things for the sake of character, but it's a lot. It's kind of shows you how leaning a little too much, maybe, into those things can make everything feel like this weird mess. And like I said, and how a lot of it feels cryptic, but not in that intriguing sense that they're kind of going for. You can tell they're going for. It's just kind of all over the place. But like I said, if you know what's going on, there's also the scene with his dad towards the end also that's nice. But like I said, it feels like there's not a whole lot of build up to a lot of this, so it's just these individual scenes happening, and the individual scenes are great by themselves. And being able to appreciate those, and like I said, especially the way Hurt is able to make these really awkward moments and this really awkward dialogue feel real, is where kind of the heart of it is. And his scenes with Woods, I feel like his scenes with Woods ring a lot more true than his scenes with Weaver. which is surely clearly not supposed to be the case, but yeah, so that's basically how I feel about that. And then obviously there's also a big action climax as well, where, like I said, the suspense is there, but we've just felt so all over the place at this point. It's wild. But that's the thing, though. It does feel like there is always something around the corner on this movie, and you're never not quite sure what it's going to be. So, like, even if it's not exactly well put together as a whole, as a movie, there's still something very entertaining about this movie, in its individual parts, and kind of just how all over the place it is. There's just something in general kind of interesting about that also. So, yeah, so, I mean, this is obviously probably something I'll watch eventually again down the road, just, like I said, because there's just a sort of craziness to it and a hecticness to it, where, even though I've been criticizing it for that, there's still an entertainment value in it. So, that's... So, let's go on to something completely different, which was his August entry into this year, which was Body Heat, which is probably one of the more famous ones we'll talk about. Especially since it is written and directed by Lawrence Kasdan, and I believe this was Kasdan's first movie, and Kasdan is, of course, somebody we're going to talk about at least a couple more times in this very series, so this was a teaming that definitely spawned something that was just kind of movie magic between them, and there is... at first, I do remember it kind of having criticisms where a lot of people compared it to Double Indemnity, which makes sense, because, like, I could have basically done, like, a versus segment on these two, but, I don't know, this movie still feels like kind of its own thing, but, I did forget something I need to step off real quick, but I will just say, as far as this movie goes, as far as its noir vibe, which is where the Double Indemnity comparisons come in, there is... I feel like there's something still completely natural to it, and something that absolutely fits the tone of this enough that it never really feels like it's sort of, you know, trying to be Double Indemnity or another movie or anything like that. It does feel very much like its own thing. But what I really love especially about the sort of noir vibe to it is that it manages to achieve that when it doesn't even seem like it's trying to. Because when you look at the opening scene, and you have, like, you know, the opening credits, where we have, like, the score, and just the way it's shot, and everything, the John Barry score, which is fantastic, and very sort of, feels like it's supposed to be of this different era, that accomplishes really well. When you think noir, you would think, like, the main character is almost always, like, a private investigator of sorts. And so it's like, when we get these opening shots, and we see Hurt, you know, at the window, watching everything burn, even though he's a lawyer, and not even really a great one, it's like, as soon as we pan over to him, and we see a woman in his bed and stuff like that, and he's just speaking, just immediately, just right off the top of your head, if you had to guess what this guy did, just based on this imagery and the score and everything else and this introduction, you would probably say he's probably a private investigator, when he's not. I mean, his work requires things of that nature, but still, like, it gives you those vibes, even though that's not even what its intention is for this character, and that I always find really interesting. But there's also this thing going on where this movie accomplishes something that feels like it's kind of a bygone era, which is being the erotic thriller, essentially, where, to start off with, I guess, we can talk about, you know, just the title itself, and how heat comes into play, and the way heat looks on screen, where, like, there's this discomfort, and everybody's sweating, everybody's glistening, and heat can obviously lead to, you know, short tempers and rising tensions, but there's still, like, this building desire of sorts you could also relate to heat. And in many cases, what's really interesting is that sex scenes tend to be the most boring scenes in movies a lot of the time. It's like, yeah, there's obviously, you know, the PG-13 sex scene that has never been useful in pretty much any movie ever, with the exception of maybe a small handful. But everything else, it's always like, it's just there either to be there, or it's for shock value, or it's for to just elicit some sort of cheap reaction from the audience. When it's in, like, you know, action movies, and like it's always just a throwaway scene that's here just eating time, and nobody really cares about them that much. So this felt like it was at a time where, like, that desire that is shown on screen between two people, is very crucial. Like, plays a very crucial part to everything about, whether it be the characters and the way they come together, or it's the, literally, if you have to, there's the atmosphere, all of that. And it's like, there's this movie especially, you have to know and you have to see for yourself why this character, Ned, the William Hurt character, would make the decisions that he does based on his desire for Turner. And that only really shows when we've seen practically every step of their desire for each other, and we've seen all these sex scenes and all these moments when they're just openly, you know, literally bare to each other for long periods of time in the first half of this movie, so that when this other part comes around where she needs him to do something, the way he just falls into it so effortlessly, because we've seen the build-up of his desire and that whole thing of, it gives you the idea, like, it takes you to a familiar place, to where it's like, when you feel a certain attraction to someone, and the way that can just completely take over to the point that you're like, yeah, as long as I get to physically be with this person, I'm going to do everything to make that happen. And then the way this takes that up to the notch of, naturally, in a movie like this, a murder being committed. Like I said, because we've seen the desire and the physical passion up to that point, we can completely feel it when the character starts making these rash decisions, and for this particular character. And the fact that it really takes its time building that relationship too, but while also always introducing elements that will eventually come back and play bigger parts. Like, there's not really anything in this movie that doesn't belong. It's like really concisely put together. You can really tell that it's like a writer-director's movie, where it kind of starts and ends with one particular person's vision that really meticulously put this story together. And it fits together into this really concise puzzle at the end of it. Like, even if it feels like it takes its time getting to where it's going, there's like so many pieces falling into place at once, that it's... Yeah, and it's pretty amazing that it's a debut movie at that, because it's like, there's sometimes where a debut movie can feel like, yeah, this is definitely this person's first movie, and they're trying some things out, and not everything's working, but yeah, they might have potential. And then there's debuts like this one, to where it's like, you can tell they've been putting everything into this, and they were like, I'm gonna come out of the gate as big as I possibly can. And then this is going to be what happens. And like I said, and the way they use just all these classic traits in general, where it's like one of the things I talked about a lot when we do our Q&As and Noir comes up, I talk about smoke-filled rooms. Seems to always be a thing in that also. And I love that, like, everybody in this... Like, here's the thing about smoking that's complicated, I guess, which is... I am one of those people where I think, like, you know, smoking is disgusting and it makes people haggard and smell bad, and if I see somebody smoking, I'm probably silently judging them. But with that said, smoking has always and will always look awesome on screen, and that's just the way it is. And it's like Robert Mitchum made, like, smoking an art form, and stuff like Out of the Past and stuff like that. And here, Yeah, that's the thing. I love the scene when they're all in the room, and it's one character asks, "Can I smoke? Do you mind if I smoke?" And then everybody in the room takes that as a cue, and everybody lights up at the same time, with the exception of Ted Danson, who's just there saying, "Yeah, I don't smoke, but I'll just breathe. I'll get the same effect." So yeah, just all these elements come in, and like I said, it still feels like its own movie while taking in these traits, and that's where I think its real strength is. Apart from bringing this passionate relationship to the screen and then showing the effect that such, feelings of desire can have in this sort of negative sense, and that it completely warp your perception and change who you are and change your morals and change everything, if it's strong enough, and if the person at the center of this is this, enough of a femme fatale to take you in that direction. And obviously Kathleen Turner's really gonna pull that off, and it's the way the characters, like, you can, like, it's almost like there's, the characters are like this sort of cycle, and everything at the middle is this whole storm that's been started by this Turner character, and it's like the way she looks, the way she sounds, her general presence, everything about her, you just believe it immediately, the way characters react to her, the way it seems like the world just stops whenever she's on screen or whenever she appears. And I think this was one of her first movies also, if not her first movie. And the way she was able to kind of have that classic vibe about her that she was able to carry through. It's like, it's a weird comparison maybe, but you can see that this is the person that would inevitably play Jessica Rabbit or something. Again, I know it's kind of a weird comparison, but it's also kind of not. It's actually quite fitting, weirdly enough. But yeah, so everything as far as the cast, because this does have, like, we talk about these main characters, but it does have an amazing side cast also. I already talked about Ted Danson. And Ted Danson in particular seems like he's just relishing every single moment of this. Like, he could have just been just a random side character that just gave exposition or whatever, but I feel like every scene that Ted Danson is in this movie is on fire, in this really great way, where it's like there's the moment where the little girl Heather comes in, and she's, this witness that may or may not have seen Hurt in a compromised position with Turner, and it's like, what did she say to Ted Danson? Did she say too much? And so there's this scene at the diner where Danson's just saying, like, seems like he's inching towards that, and then he goes away, and then he comes back, and then there's always the, "Oh, and one more thing," and then he says one more thing, and then, "Oh, one more thing," and you're always thinking the one more thing is going to be, "Oh, by the way, it was totally you, and we know everything, the jig is up, everything is exposed." But the scene just keeps toying with that, the way he keeps saying, like, "Oh, and one more thing," which is just so incredibly well written. And then there's just the details of, like, just his dancing. Like, it just seems like this character quirk at first, but then it almost feels like there's something sinister about it by the time we get to him on dancing on the pier in the dead of night. Is just a scene that always really stuck out to me, where it's like, where he's technically the character that, is on the right side of the law, but at the same time, it's like, because we're so in Hurt's position and we understand Hurt's position, that it's like I said, there's almost something sinister about every time Ted Danson shows up, because it's like, it feels like we're one step closer to everything being out in the open when we see him, and the way that's handled is great. And obviously a crucial character we haven't mentioned yet is Richard Corona, who is her husband, who is the subject of this potential murder. And this is when it kind of throws in common thriller elements, which are good when they're well utilized, where it's like there's a character that knows something that this particular character doesn't, and it's like the way they come to this meeting, but Crenna doesn't know who Hurt is and his relationship with Turner. So it's like there's one character knows this, the other doesn't, but then again, we honestly also don't know how much the other character knows or doesn't know. And when you see them do like this back and forth, that there's always something really interesting there. And then just sort of as Hurt falls more into this desire for Turner, just kind of the more blunt everything becomes and straightforward everything becomes. Where there's the line where he says, Richard Crenna must die for no other reason than they want him to. And it's like we kind of see the character starting to shape into something else entirely, and how we kind of see that he's almost been sort of lazing his way through life, and how he doesn't really take his job all that seriously, and just seems basically dead to the world, and then this is like the thing that gives him the passion. Only it shapes him in sort of all the wrong ways, in a way that, desire for another person can potentially do. Especially a character as dangerous as Turner is. And another side character I didn't mention that's interesting especially is Mickey Rourke, because this is widely considered to be Rourke's sort of breakout part, but I think he only has maybe 2 scenes in it. The first time we meet him, and then the scene in the interrogation room. And it's like, with these 2 scenes, he was basically able to just show everything that he had, and to show, to sort of foreshadow these really big scenes he'd have later in his career, and how he's just somebody that obviously at the time, you could say that he was an actor that could have easily coasted on his looks, but it's like, based on this role and forward, it's sort of like he was doing character actor stuff for a while there when he was first starting, before he started getting leading roles. But then even in his leading roles, it still felt like he was doing character actor stuff. Like when you look at stuff like Barfly and stuff like that, and how he was able to find this real intensity, but also this sort of vulnerability also that he did really, really well. And it's like it's always such a shame every time it seemed like, Mickey Rourke was in this really good place. He'd just kind of resort back to action shit again, and being in side roles and stuff like that, and throwaway parts, because he really has such a gift, that he could really continuously bring here. But that's just the unfortunate nature of Mickey Rourke, I guess. But he's definitely got it, and he was definitely showing it in these early parts of his career. And what's really great here also is that when you look at it from the perspective of, I was saying how when you see everything from Hurt's perspective, but of course, naturally, this is one of those movies with a twist that can literally change everything. You can watch the movie once, and it's one movie, and then you can watch the movie again, and it feels like a completely different movie. When you're looking at it from Hurt's perspective versus when you're looking at it from Turner's, because obviously the way Turner has made everything fall into place has completely changes the not the outcome, but how everything happened. At each step of this movie was pre-planned by her, in just true sort of femme fatale, in the true femme fatale way. So I especially love that moment at the end when she says that she loves him one more time before she literally disappears into the blackness. And I love this image where it's only her against just pitch blackness, and then the way she seems to just kind of turn into it, and just in this turn she just disappears seemingly entirely. And it's because just the way everything looks, because one thing I didn't mention that I forgot to mention was just in general the way the movie uses its location also really stands out, because this is also the kind of thing that could just be taken for granted and could just be a throwaway thing or a throwaway location or whatever, but it's the way it really uses it, especially with the idea of the fact that there's a building sort of heat going on in this, and whenever everybody's crammed into the diner, you really get that sense of sort of claustrophobia. But then when they're outside, you can basically smell Florida when it's the night scenes, and just the way all of this is utilized is just perfect. So the reason I pulled out Ebert's book here is that I hope it doesn't take me too long to find it. He has the perfect description here where he's talking about Ned as a character and Hurt in general, and he just gives the perfect description of her, probably the most perfect description of William Hurt's acting in general that I've seen. Yeah, here it is. A tall, already balding, and only handsome man with a certain lazy arrogance to his speech, as if amused by his own intelligence. Yeah, that's the way he's describing Hurt's performance as Ned, but I kind of feel like that just in general really narrows down just Hurt as a performer in general, and it might sound like there's some kind of negative trait in there, but there's really no negativity in that at all. It all is, just perfectly describes how Hurt had such this sort of seemingly effortless way of playing the characters that he played. Like I said, like Ebert was saying, to the point to where there's almost an arrogance to it, but he was never not charming. That always stood out to me. Also, that particular description. Yeah, and on that, I think that's pretty much mainly what I wanted to say here. So, we will continue this, where we double up again, this time in 1983, with the Big Chill in Gorky Park. So, we'll have fun talking about those. And then after that will be his Oscar win. But of course, in between, we're still doing the remake verses and stuff like that, and other things in between, like reviews and stuff like that, like for new releases and stuff like that. So, yeah, that's what we've got going on. So until the next thing, I think that's it.